going to trace out some birds for a bifold screen. I found a good source for bird stencils. I'm going to trace out and digitize 6 of these birds, and I'm going to CO2 laser on a pine panel. I printed each bird full size for the tracing. I'm using Digitize 2018, and I've selected tracing polylines. All I'm going to do here is trace out each section and close up that vector. I always use some sort of a marker to show either what I've traced or where I've started. It's important for me to note where I started to do the trace because I don't want to come around and cause a crossed vector. I like to do the best I can when I'm tracing because then I don't have to do too much node editing. The other trick here is to keep track of what you've traced so you don't trace it twice. Tracing these diagrams is relatively easy because they're large diagrams. The bigger the diagram, the easier it is to trace out. You can see here what I've marked off, where I've started, what I've completed. Once I'm finished all the tracing, I'll create my final file, the DXF file. I'm going to load that file into Vectric Aspire 10.5, check the vector quality, and make sure there's no editing required. Shown here, I'm in Vectric Aspire 10.5, and the vectors look good. Now we're going to start drawing out bird number 2. Again, I'm using Digitize 2018, and I've selected tracing polylines. As before, I'm just going to trace out each part, close up that vector, and carry on to the next part until I have the whole bird traced out. Sometimes I mark each section after I've done it, or I put a red mark where I start. Sometimes I don't. It just depends how I feel. Actually, I think it's concentration. I find sometimes I can just concentrate so hard that I don't trace something twice, but I do like sometimes to add a small red mark just to remind me that I've done that and I've started there. It doesn't take very long to trace out these birds. Again, once I'm finished doing all the tracing on this bird, I'll save it as a final file, a DXF file. I'll put that file into Vectric Aspire 10.5, check the vector quality, and see if there's any node editing required. Here, the vector quality is good. We're all set to trace out the next bird. Again, I'm using Digitize 2018. And I've selected tracing as a different type of trace. I try and use different tracing techniques. My favorite just seems to be the polyline tracing. I don't show it here, but every once in a while I do save my work just in case I make a mistake and I can go back to the better portion that I've traced out. Mind you, there is an editor and you can go back, toggle to that area where you made a mistake and retrace it. Getting close now to finishing up this bird, so I'll save my file as a DXF file, and I'm going to load that file into Vectric Aspire 10.5, check the vector quality, and see if there's any node editing required. The vectors look good. Now we're on to the next bird. Again, I'm using Logic Trace 2018, and I've selected tracing as my method of digitizing. I did start off here by marking some of the areas where I started my trace. It's actually good practice to mark where you started, because it saves a lot of editing at the end when you create your file. To have a nice clean file, it's fantastic. Again, I'm finished tracing this bird. I'm going to save my final file as a DXF file. I'm going to then load that file into Vectric Aspire 10.5. We'll check the vector quality and see if there's any node editing required. As it turns out, it's fine. Ready to trace the next bird. This is going to look really neat, because once I'm finished, I'm going to laser engrave each one of these birds into a 1/4 inch pine panel using the CO2 laser. And then I'm going to take these 6 panels and frame them onto a screen that are hinged, kind of like a room divider. Again, I'm finished tracing out this bird. I'm going to save my file as a DXF file. I'm going to load that file into Vectric Aspire 10.5. We're going to check the vector quality and make sure there's no editing required. The vector quality is good. Ready to trace out the next bird. Again, we're going to load that file into Vectric Aspire 10.5 and check it. Now I'm going to load each one of those DXF files into the 150 watt CO2 laser, and I'm going to engrave each panel. The engraving here is actually a low power cut. It makes the burn look like a dark black line, a nice outline. Once I'm finished lasering the 6 panels, the 6 1/4-inch pine panels, I'm then going to build a pine frame with 3 sections hinged together to house the 6 panels that I've just lasered. Shown here is the pine frame. These frames put together with hinges end up looking like a dressing screen or a room partition. So now you can see the finished product. There's the 6 panels on display. Looks good.